Good morning and welcome. Today we'll be looking at chemical combination. Chemical combination. So what do we mean by chemical combination? This has to do with the various ways in which compounds and molecules are bonded. So these are the various ways in which chemicals and compounds and molecules are bonded, and that chemical bond we say is a cohesive force between atoms when they combine chemically. So that is your chemical bond. When compounds combine chemically, there is a bond between them, and we call that bond a chemical bond. So chemical combination just has to do with the various bonds in which different compounds use, different molecules use, and that's what we'll be looking at today. So I love to classify them into two broad classes. We have the intermolecular bond. Intermolecular bond, you won't see this anywhere, and this is the intermolecular bond. This is the one you probably see. So what do I mean by the intramolecular bond? These are the bonds that are formed within the molecule. So within the molecule, and we have your ionic or electrovalent bond. Number 2, we have your covalent bond. Number 3, we have your coordinate covalent bond. Your coordinate covalent bond, also known as your dative bond. And lastly, we have your metallic bond. So these are the bonds within the molecule. So let's say, for example, we have sodium chloride within the molecular compound. So let's say we have sodium chloride. So in the sodium chloride, for you to get, let me say, a larger amount of salt, you have to have different molecules of sodium chloride. So we have one sodium chloride, another sodium chloride, another sodium chloride, something like this. So the bond between the atoms in the molecule, that is the intermolecular bond. That is the bond between sodium and chlorine now, which is our ionic bond. This is the bond I'm talking about as your intermolecular bond. Then the bond between these substances is what we now call the what? The intermolecular bond. Sorry about that. So the intermolecular bond between molecules, and for that we have your one hydrogen bond. Your hydrogen bond. Number 2, we have your van der Waals forces. Van der Waals. And number 3, we have your dipolar forces. So these are the different chemical bonds we'll be looking at today. So take note, I say this one is within let's see, between the atoms of a molecule. Between the atoms of a molecule. So this one is between the atoms, while this is between the molecules themselves. So let me just put it here. Between the molecules. So let's start with our ionic or electrovalent bond. Ionic or electrovalent bond. So when you hear the word ionic, what comes to mind? Basically, I would say when you hear the word ionic, you think of charges, ions. And what are ions? First of all, we have to define what ions are. You say ions are charged particles formed. They are charged particles formed when an atom loses or gains an electron, or electrons, gains an electron or electrons. So that is it basically for ions. And what are the types of ions we have? For ions, we have your cations, which are positively charged, and we have your what? Anions, which are negatively charged. A few students understand best when you use flow charts, so you'll be seeing a lot of flow charts, to help it stick better. So for cations, you see they are positively charged, while for anions they are what? Negatively charged. So let's just take down some notes on this. So you can see these are the differences. Number one, positively charged, while the anions are negatively charged. You see, this ones they form ions by what? Losing electrons. So for them to become positively charged, that means they will lose electron, and that means your protons will now be more than your electrons. That is what makes them positively charged. So we say they form ions formed by losing electrons, while these ones we say they are formed by gaining electrons, formed by gaining electrons. What else can we say about them? Okay, cations, they move towards the cathode. As we move on, look at the topic electrolytes, and you see that what? Cations move towards the cathode of a battery or of an electrolyte, move towards the cathode. That's why they are called cations, so cathode ions, while this one they move towards the anode. and that is why they are called what? Anions, anode ions. You get? So just remember it came from two words, cathode and what? Ions. So cathode ions, and this came from anode and ions. So anode ions. So when in doubt, always remember this. So examples, basically for examples of your cations, we say all group 1 to 3 elements. All group 1 to group 3 elements, they all form cations when they lose electrons. So example, we have sodium, we have calcium, and let's leave it at aluminium. While for examples of your, what will I call them now? Examples of your anions, we see all group 5, all group 5. Group 5 to group 7. Elements fall under your anions. So examples, we have your nitrogen, which is 3 minus. We have your sulfur, which is 2 minus, and we have your chlorine, which is just 1 minus. So basically these are your ions. So when ionic bonds are formed, what happens? These ions come together, positive and negative. Always know that opposite attracts, like repels. That is same thing with your chemical, your ionic or electrovalent bond. The what? These oppositely charged particles attract, and they combine in what we call their inverse proportions. So let's quickly look at it. So let's call it formation of ionic bond. So we have seen what ion is. So let's look at the formation of the ionic or electrovalent bond. Always know that it is the same. They can bring any of these names in exam. Electrovalent bond. So how do they form? We see they form in what? Inverse proportion. In inverse proportion of their charges. Ionic bonds are, or let's say compounds are formed by combining ions in the inverse proportion of their charges. In the inverse proportion of their charges. So continue from here in our next video.